Now you talk about terror. I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. Today we're going to discuss Israeli military policy, in particular, how that policy is directed towards the subject population in the Gaza Strip, 1.8 million Palestinians trapped in the largest open-air prison in the world. We're going to focus on the assault last summer that left over 2,000 dead, including over 500 children, what that means for where Israel is going to go, and what that means for the Palestinians themselves. In the studio with me is Max Blumenthal, the author of The 51-Day War, as well as Goliath, which without question, I think, is the most important book on modern-day Israel. Thank you, Max.
Thanks for having me.
So we've seen, going back to 2006, a series of very heavy military strikes carried out by Israel against a completely captive population in Gaza. 2006, when they were attempting to free the Israeli soldier Shalit. 2007, 2008 and 9 with Cast Lead, Pillar of Cloud, 2002, and last summer, the most extensive assault on the Gaza Strip with Protective Edge. Why? Why does Israel keep using this kind of military force, and why do they keep ratcheting it up?
Well, it's fairly simple if you consider that the Gaza Strip has really been the base of the Palestinian armed struggle since the 1950s, and that Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have not relented in their quest to liberate themselves. They've chosen to use arms as one method. Since the Israeli disengagement from Gaza in 2005, when several thousand fanatical settlers were pulled out by Israeli forces, and the Gaza Strip was occupied through the panopticon model, in other words, occupied from without, placed under siege. The attacks on the Gaza Strip have grown more intense as the armed factions in the Gaza Strip underwent a process of militarization of their own, in which they shifted from, attacks on soft Israeli targets.
You're talking about like suicide bombings?
Like the suicide bombing, for example. It was completely scrapped after 2005. Right. And through the Philadelphia corridor in the southern city of Rafah, the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, and other armed factions were able to actually import the kind of weapons that any guerrilla army possesses.
Through tunnels.
Through tunnels, mainly light weapons, right. Rocket-propelled grenades, and also they enhanced their production capacity of mortars and rockets. The rockets were able to reach longer distances to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And the point was to challenge the Israeli military directly, which built up to what we saw in Operation Protective Edge, especially in the Battle of Shuja'iyah. Meanwhile, the Israeli military adopted a doctrine which it named after a neighborhood in southern Beirut that it destroyed in the 2006 campaign against Hezbollah, called the Dahiya Doctrine. This is a neighborhood in southern Beirut, Dahiya, that was a base of support for Hezbollah. The neighborhood was completely destroyed by the Israeli Air Force, and it reflected the view of this operation to destroy this neighborhood, to attack the civilian population, reflected the view of the Israeli military intelligence apparatus, which was that it was not going to be possible to militarily defeat and dislodge Hezbollah or Hamas, which was in control of the Gaza Strip since 2006. Therefore, the civilian population had to be attacked in order to pressure it to give up support for the armed struggle, support for armed resistance, and to be pacified as the Palestinians inside the West Bank have been under the authority of under the control of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank coordinates with the Israeli military and is basically a native subcontractor for the occupation.
Well, they carry out the security on behalf of Israel.
Exactly.
For which they receive a fair Which they're paid.
So the Dahiya Doctrine aims to, by attacking civilians, aims to demoralize the civilian population until they assent to the West Bank model. What former Israeli Army Chief of Staff Benny Gantz refers to as mowing the lawn. And this means applying the Dahiya Doctrine every few years in order to grind down the resistance, as well as an intentional program to spur long-term exhaustive reconstruction processes that can't be comprehensively carried out. That was expressed in a paper produced in 2008 for the Institute for National Security Studies by former Israeli General Gabi Saboni, called Disproportionate Force. And it directly calls for causing massive reconstruction
processes. But what you
processes.
see going back to 2006 is that it's not working. And in the incursion last summer, you had 68 Israelis killed, which is a high number in Israel. Most of them were soldiers. They were killed by Hamas fighters inside Gaza. And we have Israeli officials, Livni, Avigdor Lieberman, and others, talking about another strike being inevitable.
Right. I mean, the Dahiya Doctrine has failed in almost every respect, which is why the violence intensifies each time. So in 2008, 2009, which was the first major assault on the Gaza Strip.
This was the CAS-led.
CAS-led. We saw one family in particular lose most of its members, the Samuni family, I think in Beit Hanun. In this assault, we saw over 50 families lose most or all members. I saw in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, a report that 89 families were erased from the civil registry in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem concluded that the Israeli military had adopted an open fire policy that included targeting family homes. And if you understand how people live in the Gaza Strip, which is one of the most densely populated areas on earth, I mean, the homes are 3 to 4, sometimes 5 stories high, and each story represents a generation of a family. So when it gets hit by a missile, you see a family liquidated. A reporter I spoke to who was in Gaza before I was able to get permission to enter visited the home of the Bach family. The father of the family was the head of the police department in Gaza City, so he was targeted. The Israeli military, they love to kill cops. They consider cops to be a military target, and so this is one of their cop killing operations. But they knew his whole family was in the house with him. They aimed to surprise them, of course, in order to eliminate their target. And when the reporter arrived, he found that over 20 members of this family had been killed in one strike. He found fingers on the ground, and he said that limbs were hanging from the trees. So this violence is intensified, and it also it reached sectors of Gazan society that had never been attacked before, like the educated middle class, which lives in the soft heart of Gaza City. So not only was 20% of the entire area of the Gaza Strip reduced to rubble, in the border areas, the areas bordering Israel, which are fortified by the armed factions in the Gaza Strip. These are where the tunnels are and so on. But we saw residential high-rises in the center of Gaza City brought down towards the end of the war by a very frustrated Goliath, unable to punish David into submission. And so Netanyahu's approval ratings were flagging. The Israeli public wanted more violence. He ordered strikes on, for example, Zafar 4, which is a 14-story residential high-rise inhabited mostly by people who support the rival of Hamas, Fatah. He attacked Basha Tower, which is the oldest civilian high-rise in the Gaza Strip, the largest one, and it's home to the media. It's as if, a foreign army brought down the CNN tower in Atlanta or, bombed us right now.
I want to ask about the disparity between what Israel says it does and what it does. Even if you go on the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force website, it goes on and on about how it protects civilians, it won't target families, it cares about human rights, and yet the reality on the ground, and you and I have been on the ground, is really just indiscriminate, wholesale slaughter of primarily civilians, including children.
Yeah, I mean, the testimonies I gathered in the rubble were described sadism and savagery that I had never
Give me
heard
some
of
examples
before.
of that.
I mean, we heard constantly about human shields.
Right, which we should be clear were not being used by Hamas.
Right, and it also it contravenes the ethos of the young men of the Al-Qassam brigades.
Right.
Their ethos is based on honor and bravery, and they would never put children in front of them when confronting Israeli soldiers. I mean, they pride themselves on confronting them directly in really daring operations. And you can see those operations on video for the first time, like the Nahal Oz operation, where an Al-Qassam team tunneled into an Israeli military base in Israeli territory with GoPro cameras attached to their helmets, killed every soldier inside the base, took a Tavor rifle, and went back into the tunnel. I mean, this was a direct confrontation with the most powerful military in the Middle East, and they succeeded through the kind of cavalier attitude that they wanted to display and project to the outside world. I mean, and this is important if you understand from a Palestinian perspective that most of what you've seen throughout your life, either directly or on YouTube videos or news reports, are Israeli soldiers humiliating Palestinians. Right. So now the tables are turned. But the ability of the armed factions to protect civilians from Israeli savagery inside the Gaza Strip was very limited. So you had instances in eastern Rafah, for example, where the Israeli military advanced on July 26th on the Abu Said family home, took 30 members of the family out of the home during an iftar, during Ramadan, asked, "Does anyone speak Hebrew?" The father answers in the affirmative. They shoot him in the chest and leave him to bleed to death. He miraculously survives. They send the family marching towards the city of Rafah. This is kind of a semi-rural area. And they take 19-year-old Mahmoud Abu Said into his home, strip him down, put him in a room with a muzzled dog, wrap him in a carpet, and then when they're ready, they take him out, stand him by the window, and shoot over his shoulders as they pick off his neighbors. And I heard story after story of human shields in the border regions of the Gaza Strip. These are human shields being used by a very cowardly Israeli military to protect themselves. Another instance was the Wahadan family in Beit Hanun, who were ordered to stay in their house for a week as the Israeli military used it as a base of operations. And then when the military left, they called in artillery strikes, destroying the entire neighborhood in an hour. And when I arrived, there were still young men, this is weeks later, looking for the pieces of a 2-year-old member of this family, Rena Wahadan, and her 52-year-old aunt, Baghdad. The town of Hosea, which is a very small farming town, located hard against the Israeli border, one of the first areas that Israeli soldiers took, was placed basically under siege for 10 days. The Israelis declared it a closed military zone. The International Red Cross couldn't get in. It's during Ramadan, people are fasting, there's no water, no electricity. The town is being completely destroyed, and there are 7,000 people trapped with Israeli soldiers honeycombed within the town. And so you hear stories about like the Rujela family attempting to escape and leaving their daughter out on the road as they fall under attack from a tank division. The daughter, Gadir, who's 16, is severely handicapped and is severely physically disabled and unable to walk. She's in a wheelchair, and so she's left on the road in a wheelchair. And when the soldiers finally leave, days later, she's found by her wheelchair on the road, alone, decomposing, riddled with bullets, along with many other bodies. Now, one of the few paramedics who was brave enough to attempt to get into this town of Hosea when it was under the closed military order was named Mohammed Matar Abadla. And actually, when we did a talk in Princeton, one of his relatives spoke in the crowd. At the talk. Yeah. And I interviewed 2 of Abadla's colleagues in Gaza City, and they told me what happened on July 26th when they went in their ambulance for the Palestinian Red Crescent to retrieve a body that had been lashed to a tree by Israeli soldiers and shot in the leg. I don't know if the person was alive or not. The Israeli soldiers told Abadla to get out of the ambulance. He's the driver, take a few steps forward, hold a lighter over his head, and then they shot him in the chest and executed him. And this happened on July 26th. So I wanted to understand why this was happening, just as I wanted to understand why I heard so many testimonies of men who said they spoke Hebrew and were shot by Israeli soldiers.
Right, I was going to ask you about that.
Now, I wasn't able to really determine why men were shot for speaking Hebrew, except that perhaps they could have been seen as, spies or people who can translate and decode communications, military communications. Israeli soldiers under their ethics code are given unlimited capacity to eliminate anyone who can be seen as a threat. So one thing they're told they can do is kill someone who is holding a cell phone. We saw in the Goldstone report, the UN fact-finding mission on Operation Cast Lead, cases of men who were holding cell phones who were killed. You're holding a cell phone, so you're seen possibly as doing command and control for the armed factions. So I interviewed Colonel Desmond Travers, who's one of the 4 authors of the Goldstone report. He's an expert in counterinsurgency, an Irish colonel, and he told me that one reason why the soldiers would ask Abadla to hold a lighter over his head is so they could say, yeah, we killed him, but we thought he was holding a cell phone and giving orders and calling in our location to armed factions in the area. So it was our mistake, but under the ethics code, we're authorized to kill anyone who could be seen as a threat.
But you did find that it was a pattern to shoot, I think you said older men who spoke Hebrew.
Yeah, I heard about cases in Hosea. Nasser Shamali is someone who was shot in Shujaiya after addressing soldiers in Hebrew.
Do you have any idea why?
And Dan Cohen, my colleague, actually tracked Shamali down and he was shot in the arm, and the soldier thought he was dead. And we actually tracked him down and confirmed this. There are other, and then I mentioned Mahmoud Abu Said's father in Rafah. So none of these people know each other, but they each described a similar situation. So the 2 theories are that, one, the soldiers were frightened that these men could understand the orders they were giving to one another, and 2, that these soldiers, who were themselves raised under a regime of ethno-religious separation between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, are seeking to harden that regime by sending the message that you will not help us, and to send a message to an entire society that we don't want any involvement with you in our societies. Don't try to speak Hebrew to us. Don't try to help us. Here's what you get. Which is something that we've seen throughout, colonial interactions with, natives who attempted to be.
I want to ask you about the use of experimental weapons, which was true, I think, in Cast Lead with Dime, which you wrote about. I believe you wrote about that in Goliath.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about the experimental weapons, and then before we close, a little bit, because it's not working, and because we have seen senior Israeli officials talk about further massive military assaults as inevitable, where we're headed.
Yeah.
But let's talk about, just quickly, about these horrific weapons that they're testing. I mean, they're using the people of Gaza like guinea pigs.
Well, since 2006, Israel has used dense inert metal explosives, which were designed actually by figures in Israeli academia, including quantum physicists in collaboration with the Israeli military, for assassinations. The point of these weapons is to generate a massive explosive capacity, but within a limited range, to actually eliminate or limit civilian casualties to the target. And I can't explain how these weapons operate. They're tungsten based, right? And they attack the soft tissue and cause death over a period of days. And the way that you identify the munitions is through a very small entry wound and then massive burning of the organs. We're talking about an entry wound that could be little more than 1 millimeter wide. So I interviewed Hani Shaniti, who's a doctor who's in charge of documentation at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, who told me of as many as 20 injuries he treated like this. Sometimes if they can treat the organs immediately or perform amputation, the patient can be saved, but often the patient will just mysteriously die after a few days with very little exterior wounds or very little injury to the skeleton. Dr. Samir Holmes, who treated victims at his dental clinic and OBGYN clinic in central Rafah on Black Friday, August 4th in Rafah, after Israel threatened to bomb the main hospital, told me of these wounds before, that he had never seen them. So this is an experimental weapon that's been tested in the Gaza Strip over the course of the last 8 or 9 years. It's very disturbing to hear about it, but then at the same time we see conventional weapons being tested.
Right.
Like, for example, the Spike 4 missile, which was used in the attack at the beginning of Operation Cast Lead in December 2008 on the police cadet graduation ceremony in Gaza City, where dozens of police cadets were killed, scores were wounded, their organs and body parts were splattered across an entire area while they were celebrating their graduation as police cadets to direct traffic and that kind of thing. So this is another example of mass cop killing. The missile that was used in that attack then appeared in international weapons fairs. And, it's a good missile, from a military perspective. It's not the best missile, it's a good missile. But what gives the Israeli military its advantage is that they can stamp this missile with the brand field tested. We used it in this operation. It was successful.
The same with the drones.
Yeah, the Elbit Hermes 450 drone. They're introducing the Hermes 900 drone now. These have been exported to Brazil to monitor the World Cup. And Israel's now, even at a recent weapons fair, introduced the suicide drone, which is a drone that loiters over the target, in the words of Elbit Systems, and then crashes directly into the target with a nose packed with explosives. So these wars are necessary to test these weapons and then market them. The defense minister often goes into a role as a lobbyist for the weapons industry. Ehud Barak is a former defense minister who's become one of the wealthiest people in Israel through this kind of revolving door system. 150,000 families, according to Yotam Feldman, the Israeli journalist who's done some of the most research on the weapons export industry, subsist off of weapons exports in Israel. That's families. Right. And that means almost the entire upper middle class in Israel. So occupation, siege, and these mowing the lawn assaults have been incentivized for the Israeli economy and Jewish Israeli society. And it makes them very averse to peace deals. It's become such a destabilizing force in the Middle East that I don't think that Washington knows what to do with it. And so the only answer that Washington has, since it can't apply pressure, it's all carrot and no stick, is to propose to increase annual aid to Israel from $3 billion to $4.5 billion. Where does that aid go? Israel has the highest inequality rate in the OECD. It has massive child poverty in many of its peripheral cities, and that aid doesn't go to, for example, poor kids in Ashkelon. Israel is required to spend the loan money, that aid money, in Texas and in Colorado and California on weapons. What are those weapons going to be used for? Well, they're not going to be used in a conventional war against Iran. They're going to be used for more mowing the lawn assaults on the Gaza Strip, and it will fuel the Israel's own weapons industry. The only thing I can see interfering with another assault on Gaza is the fact that negotiations are taking place now to either end or relieve the siege. And we'll have to see where those go. But the discussions are based around a possible 5-year truce between Hamas and Israel.
Well, Israel's broken truces more than once.
Exactly. And if you just look at what's happened since September 1st or September 2nd of last year, when the ceasefire went into effect between Hamas and Israel, Hamas has kept the siege they've kept the ceasefire faithfully, and Israel has attacked repeatedly fishermen. They've attacked farmers in the buffer zone, and you see these Salafist extremists who have allied themselves with ISIS inside Gaza firing rockets into open areas in Israel. And how does Israel respond? By attacking Hamas.
Right.
So it's kind of like Hamas is stuck between ISIS and Israel, who are acting, at least right now, in kind of a tacit collusion to tighten that vice.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching Days of Revolt.
Had to eat out the watermelon patch. And you know they put me in a shack. Stole my name.